The soldiers said it would only take a few days. They said the roads were clear, the weather mild, the journey simple. They said the native families would be relocated, as if a people could be folded up like tents and carried somewhere else. They said the land they were leaving behind would forget them. But the land did not forget. Long before the first family was forced onto the road, the decision had already been made in rooms where native voices were never invited. Washington, D.C. was far from the forests and rivers of the Southeast. Its streets did not echo with ancestral songs or the sound of corn being ground at dawn. There the land did not speak. It waited to be measured, divided, and sold. In those halls of power, maps replaced people, and distance made cruelty easier. Andrew Jackson sat at the center of it all, a man forged by war, celebrated as a hero, feared by enemies, and worshipped by those who believed strength was the same as righteousness. To his supporters, he was the defender of the common white man. To native nations, he was a storm already forming on the horizon. Jackson did not see sovereign nations when he looked south. He saw resistance. He saw delay. He saw land that refused to become prophet quickly enough. The Indian Removal Act was presented as a solution. Its language was careful, almost gentle. It spoke of negotiation, of voluntary exchange, of relocation for protection. It promised compensation. It promised peace. What it did not promise was choice. Debates erupted in Congress. Some spoke against the bill, warning that it would stain the nation's soul. They spoke of treaties, of honor, of the Constitution itself. They asked how a government founded on liberty could justify such an act. But their voices were thin against the roar of ambition. Votes were counted. Margins were narrow. History turned not on overwhelming consensus, but on indifference just strong enough to win. When the bill passed in 1830, the room exhaled, and somewhere far away, a future began to collapse. For native nations, the news traveled slowly, carried by word of mouth, by messengers whose faces told the truth before their words could. Councils were called, fires were lit. Elders spoke long into the night, tracing the patterns of past betrayals and wondering if this one would finally break them. The Cherokee believed the law could not apply to them. They had adapted more than any other nation. They had farms, schools, written laws, even a Supreme Court of their own. They believed the United States would recognize what it had always demanded. They took their case to the highest court in the land. In 1832, the Supreme Court ruled in their favor. It declared that the state of Georgia had no authority over Cherokee land, that the nation was sovereign, that its people had rights. It should have ended there, but laws are only as strong as the will to enforce them. Andrew Jackson reportedly dismissed the ruling with quiet contempt. The court had spoken. He simply chose not to listen. The federal government stepped aside. Georgia moved in. State laws stripped Cherokee citizens of rights overnight. Their government was declared illegal. Their meetings were banned. White settlers were encouraged to squat on their land. Violence followed, then silence, then fear. Some Cherokee leaders believed removal was inevitable. They argued that survival required compromise, that signing a treaty, even a fraudulent one, was better than annihilation. Others called it betrayal. They said no group had the authority to sell land that belonged to the people, the dead and the unborn alike. The nation fractured under the weight of impossible choices. In 1835, a small faction signed the Treaty of New Echota, agreeing to removal in exchange for money and land west of the Mississippi. The majority of the Cherokee people rejected it. They protested, they pleaded, they waited for justice.
The United States ratified the treaty anyway. Time ran out. When the deadline passed and families remained on their land, the army was sent in to finish what paper had begun. Soldiers arrived in spring, when fields were planted and hope still lived close to the soil. They came in columns, spreading across towns and farms like an iron net. Homes were entered without warning. Meals were interrupted. Children were pulled from beds. The old were lifted, carried, dragged. There was no room for dignity. Families were herded into stockades, crude enclosures meant for animals, not people. The air inside was thick with sickness and despair. Food was scarce, water fouled quickly. Guards stood watch as if protecting a threat instead of imprisoning a people. Summer heat baked the camps. Disease spread silently, then everywhere. Measles, dysentery, fever. The weak fell first, the strong learned fear. When autumn arrived, the march began in earnest. The government had delayed too long. Winter loomed, and still they pushed forward. The Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Seminole were forced onto routes that twisted through mountains, across rivers and into frozen plains. Some traveled by foot, others by wagon, many by boat, packed so tightly they could barely breathe. The Mississippi River became a wall of ice and terror. Barges stalled, people froze in place, waiting for passage that might never come. Children cried until their voices broke. Parents held them close, counting breaths instead of miles. Every day, the dead were left behind. There were no markers for most graves, no names carved into stone, just hurried prayers and the sound of earth being packed down by numb hands. Sometimes not even that. Sometimes the living were forced onward while the bodies remained where they fell. A man buried his wife at dawn and walked again by noon. A mother carried her daughter's shoes long after she stopped needing them. A boy learned the shape of death before he learned the shape of manhood. The soldiers were not all cruel. Some shared food, some looked away when tears fell. But kindness could not undo orders, and orders did not allow stopping. The line had to move, schedules had to be kept. The march was larger than mercy. By the time the survivors reached Indian territory, they were hollowed out by loss. The land was unfamiliar, the soil resisted their crops, the rivers did not know their songs. They had arrived alive, but something essential had been taken on the road. The Trail of Tears was not just a path across the continent. It was a breaking point, a moment when the United States chose expansion over humanity and taught its victims that law without conscience is simply another weapon. And still, the story was not finished. Because survival is not the same as surrender.
Winter did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, the way death often does. At first, it was only the breath, visible now in the mornings, drifting from mouths like fragile ghosts. Then the nights grew longer, the ground harder, the wind sharper. Leaves vanished from trees, exposing branches that looked like raised bones against a pale sky. By the time the first snow fell, many already understood what the government had refused to admit. The march should never have been allowed to continue this late in the year. But the line moved anyway. Blankets were thin, shoes were worn through. Some walked with rags tied around their feet, each step soaking cloth with ice and blood. Wagons creaked under the weight of the sick, but there were never enough of them. Those who could not walk were sometimes left behind, not because they were unloved, but because stopping meant punishment for everyone. Snow transformed the road into something unrecognizable. Familiar paths vanished beneath white silence. Rivers froze in uneven sheets, cracking beneath footsteps, swallowing the unlucky whole. The cold did not kill quickly. It gnawed, it lingered, it waited. Children were the first to weaken. Their bodies, small and already hungry, burned through what little warmth they had. Coughs turned violent, skin turned gray. Mothers carried them for miles, arms shaking, whispering stories of home, of rivers that never froze, of summers that smelled like corn and rain. Some children died mid-sentence, their heads slipping sideways as if falling asleep. Many mothers did not stop walking when it happened. They could not. Soldiers shouted, lines pressed forward, the living were pushed past the dead, and grief was swallowed because there was no space to release it. Tears froze on cheeks, wails turned into silence. Silence became routine. At night, camps formed wherever exhaustion finally won. Fires were scarce, wood was wet, smoke stung the eyes and burned the lungs. People huddled together, bodies pressed close not for comfort, but for survival. Elders recited prayers they had learned as children, asking ancestors for strength, for mercy, for meaning. Sometimes the prayers felt unanswered. Disease thrived in the cold. Dysentery spread through camps like a curse. Fever burned through bodies already weakened by hunger. Lice crawled through hair and clothing. The smell of sickness became constant, clinging to everything, impossible to escape. Burials became mechanical. A shallow hole, frozen ground resisting every strike. A body wrapped in whatever cloth remained. No ceremony, no songs, just the knowledge that if they stayed any longer, more would join the grave. One elder collapsed beside the road, his legs refusing to carry him another step. His son lifted him once, twice, then a third time before his own knees buckled. The soldiers watched, the line slowed, orders were shouted. The elder looked up at his son, eyes clear despite the pain. "Go," he said. The son shook his head. The elder smiled, a small, tired smile, and lay back against the snow. By the time the line moved again, the snow was already covering his chest. The march continued. Some soldiers began to avert their eyes. Others hardened, burying sympathy beneath obedience. A few wrote letters home, describing what they were witnessing, unsure if anyone would believe them. Back east, newspapers spoke of progress, of relocation completed, of order restored. They did not speak of the bodies along the road. They did not speak of the mothers who stopped producing milk because hunger had emptied them. They did not speak of the children who no longer cried because crying required energy they no longer had. One night, a storm descended without warning. Wind tore through camp, flattening tents, scattering embers. Snow fell sideways, blinding anyone foolish enough to move. People huddled together as the temperature dropped, breaths shallow, bodies trembling uncontrollably. By morning, dozens were frozen where they lay. The survivors stood in silence as soldiers counted heads, numbers replacing names. The dead were noted, then left behind. The living were ordered to move. Always move. The road no longer felt like a journey. It felt like punishment stretched across miles. Some began to believe the suffering was intentional, that the government knew winter would finish what laws had begun, that death was not a side effect, but a solution. Whether that was true or not no longer mattered. The result was the same. Still, there were moments of defiance. A woman shared her last piece of bread with a stranger's child. A man carried an orphaned boy on his shoulders for an entire day.
Songs were sung quietly at night, not for joy, but to remind everyone that they were still a people, not a column of prisoners. Memory became resistance. Every step westward carried the weight of what had been taken: homes, graves, futures, and the fragile hope that something could still be rebuilt from the wreckage. When the land finally began to change, when forests thinned and the soil grew unfamiliar, many understood that the worst was not over. They had survived the road. Now they would have to survive what waited at the end of it.
The road did not end with relief. It ended with silence. When the survivors finally reached what the government called Indian Territory, there were no welcoming fires, no prepared homes, no waiting supplies laid out with care. There was only open land, vast, unfamiliar, and indifferent. The soil looked wrong, the air felt wrong, even the wind seemed to move without recognition. This place did not know their names. Families stood in small, exhausted clusters, staring across a landscape that was supposed to replace everything they had lost. Soldiers read orders, pointed directions, assigned parcels of land as if dividing spoils. Then, just like that, the army began to withdraw. The march was over. The suffering, they were told, had ended. But survival had only entered a new phase. Winter still lingered. The ground was too hard to plant. The tools many had carried from the east were broken or lost along the way. Livestock had died. Seeds were scarce. Shelters had to be built from nothing, by hands already damaged by cold and grief. The weak did not recover. Elders who had endured the road now lay down and simply stopped fighting. Their bodies had survived the journey, but their spirits had been anchored to the land left behind. They died quietly, often at night, wrapped in blankets that smelled like smoke and memory. Children wandered camps with hollow eyes, asking when they would go home. Parents struggled to explain a truth they could barely accept themselves. This was home now, whether they wished it or not. Disease followed them west. Crowded conditions and poor sanitation allowed sickness to spread unchecked. Medical supplies promised by the government arrived late or not at all. Hunger returned quickly. Rations were smaller than promised, sometimes spoiled, sometimes stolen before they reached the camps. Anger simmered beneath exhaustion. Leaders who had signed treaties were blamed. Those who had resisted were vindicated, but only in bitterness. Divisions within the nations deepened, fueled by grief and the impossible task of rebuilding from ashes. Some spoke openly of betrayal, not just by the United States, but by the idea of justice itself. The land resisted them. Rivers flooded unexpectedly, crops failed, storms tore through unfinished shelters. Each setback felt personal, as if the earth itself rejected the lie that this place could replace what had been stolen. And yet, slowly, painfully, life pushed forward. Homes were rebuilt from rough timber and determination. Councils were formed again. Laws were rewritten. Schools reopened. Children learned to read and write in a land that had tried to erase them. Songs were sung, not only for mourning, but for endurance. The people adapted because adaptation had always been part of survival. But memory never loosened its grip. At night, elders spoke of the old land, the rivers that bent just so, the mountains that caught the morning light, the burial grounds now plowed under by strangers. Children who had never seen those places learned to love them anyway, carrying grief for a home they had never known. The trail of tears lived on in these stories. It lived in the empty spaces at meals where someone should have been, in the way mothers flinched at sudden orders, in the way men stared too long at the horizon, as if measuring the distance back to something forever out of reach. Back east, life went on. Cotton fields expanded, towns grew, gold was mined from Cherokee land. History books spoke of progress and destiny. The suffering that made it possible faded into footnotes or vanished entirely. But among the survivors, forgetting was impossible. They remembered the first step away from home. They remembered the snow. They remembered the graves without names. And they understood something the nation that removed them refused to see. The Trail of Tears was not a tragedy of the past. It was a wound that continued to shape every generation that followed. Because when a people are forced to walk away from their ancestors, they carry that distance forever. The dead were buried behind them, but the living carried something heavier. It was not only grief. Grief, at least, could be named. What they carried was a quiet fracture, an invisible breaking that followed them into every new home, every council meeting, every generation born after the march. The Trail of Tears did not end at the edge of Indian territory. It settled into the bones of those who survived. Children grew up surrounded by absence. They learned the names of relatives they would never meet, spoken softly around fires, as if saying them too loudly might cause them to disappear completely. Grandmothers pointed to empty places and said, "Your aunt should have been here. Your brother would have been this tall by now." Memory became a second language, taught early and spoken often. Many survivors struggled with a guilt they could not explain. Why did I live when others did not? Why did my feet keep moving when theirs gave out? There were no answers, only nights filled with dreams of frozen roads and voices calling from behind. Some turned inward. Silence became armor. Pain was swallowed because it had once been dangerous to show it. Others turned their grief into anger, sharp, protective, always ready. Both responses were ways of surviving a world that had proven itself capable of erasing them. The leaders worked to rebuild what had been broken. Governments were reformed in exile, courts resumed, laws were passed, efforts were made to restore order, dignity, and continuity. On paper, the nations lived on, but paper could not restore the elders lost along the road, or the sacred places left behind under plows and fences. Trauma reshaped family life. Parents became fiercely protective, teaching children to obey quickly, to move fast, to hide fear. Discipline hardened, not from cruelty, but from terror learned on the march. Disobedience had once meant death. That lesson did not fade easily. At the same time, love deepened. Families clung to one another with an intensity forged by loss. Every child became precious. Every birth felt like a small victory against erasure. Names of the dead were given to the living, ensuring that no one vanished entirely. The United States continued to expand. Railroads cut across the land, states formed, flags multiplied, progress marched forward, rarely looking down at the tracks it laid over broken promises. The removal of native nations was framed as necessary, inevitable, even benevolent. The survivors knew better. They watched new treaties form and crumble. They watched promises shrink. They watched as Indian territory itself began to be carved apart, opened again to settlers, proving that removal had never been about protection. It had always been about access. Some asked the question no one in power wanted to answer. If we are removed again, where will they send us next?
the fear was not unfounded. Children were later taken from their families and sent to boarding schools where their languages were beaten out of them. Hair was cut, names were changed, culture was treated as disease. The logic was the same as removal, only quieter. Erase the people by erasing who they are. The Trail of Tears had taught the nation that this could be done. Still, resistance never died. Languages survived in whispers, ceremonies continued in secret, stories were passed down carefully, guarded against forgetting. Even those who tried to forget found that the past returned, in dreams, in habits, in the shape of their fears. One elder told his grandson, "They can move our bodies, but they cannot move our memory unless we let them." The boy remembered those words long after the elder was gone. Generations later, descendants would walk the old routes, not as prisoners, but as witnesses. They would stop where their ancestors had fallen. They would place stones, say names, and reclaim the silence that had been forced upon them. Because memory, once spoken aloud, becomes a form of justice. The Trail of Tears had tried to reduce a people to a statistic, 15,000 dead, thousands displaced. But numbers cannot hold grief. They cannot carry love. They cannot explain why a people who endured such loss still chose to live. What survived was not just a population, it was a refusal to disappear, a refusal to forget. A refusal to let the road be the final word.
They were not soldiers, not leaders, not lawmakers. They were mothers, fathers, children, and elders, the ordinary people history tried to erase. Yet in the shadows of the Trail of Tears, they became heroes of endurance, carrying courage in ways that no medal or recognition could ever measure. Mothers walked with children pressed to their chests, tiny bodies trembling against the cold and fatigue. They sang lullabies that had no rhythm, songs broken by sobs, yet persistent, as if their voices alone could keep life alive. Some carried infants wrapped in rags, already frostbitten, already sick, yet every heartbeat was an act of defiance. Every step was an affirmation, we will not disappear quietly. Children learned the lessons of survival before they even learned to read. They understood that every step mattered, that each misstep could mean separation, that the warmth of a parent's arm was fragile and fleeting. They learned to be quiet when adults whispered, to conserve energy when food ran thin, to help each other without complaint. In the face of suffering that adults could hardly comprehend, these children became the lifeline of their families. Fathers, too, bore burdens beyond counting. They carried wagons, cleared paths, lifted the weak, fought against frostbite and exhaustion, all while keeping fear tucked deep behind their eyes. They whispered promises to children who would never see home again, teaching them names of rivers, hills, and forests that might now exist only in memory. Grandparents walked as if their feet remembered roads carved long before the march began. They shared stories of abundance and peace, weaving the past into the present to remind the young that life had not always been this way. Their bodies shook, but their words remained firm, anchors in a storm of chaos and loss. And yet the soldiers remained relentless. Orders were cold, lines marched forward, death followed closely behind like a silent shadow. Snow and ice claimed their share, hunger claimed more, sickness claimed still more. But amid this, small acts of courage multiplied, acts too quiet for history books, but monumental for those who lived to tell the story. A mother once found her child had slipped into unconsciousness, shivering violently by the roadside. She wrapped him in her own coat and carried him for miles, ignoring her own frost-bitten hands. She whispered the names of ancestors she barely remembered herself, calling them into the boy's ears, demanding the spirits lend strength. He survived, barely, but survival itself became a victory. In another camp, a girl of 12 lifted her younger siblings into wagons meant for only a few. She fed them her own rations, shared her warmth, and held their hands through freezing nights. She had no choice but to become the guardian of life for those whose parents had collapsed or been taken by illness. Every day she woke, she chose to continue, a decision more heroic than any general's charge. Even the smallest gestures mattered. A stranger handed a piece of dried bread to a mother too weak to beg. Another shared a blanket when the snow was relentless. Quiet words of encouragement passed from one person to another became the glue holding entire families together. No one kept count of these moments. They were not recorded. They were simply acts of survival, repeated over and over until the column of humanity trudged forward one step at a time. And yet grief lingered at every step. Mothers buried children by the roadside with nothing but snow and frozen dirt as markers. Fathers buried wives or siblings, unable to pause for tears. Elders watched as those they had nurtured vanished quietly into the ground. The living could not stop for mourning. The march demanded continuation. Grief became survival. Survival became courage. Courage became the quiet defiance that sustained the line. The road became a classroom. It taught lessons that no one wanted to learn. It taught the children how to endure without breaking. It taught mothers and fathers how to carry both their own fear and the fear of their children. It taught every human being along the march that hope is not given freely. It is carried, step by step, in the smallest acts of courage, often unnoticed by the world. This is why, boss, the Trail of Tears is remembered not only for death, but for life, for the lives that refused to vanish quietly, for the small heroes whose courage kept generations alive, and for the defiance embedded in every heartbeat that survived.
When the march halted, it was never for comfort, it was for necessity. Soldiers herded the exhausted survivors into makeshift camps, fenced with rough timber and guarded with rifles. These were not homes, they were temporary prisons, open to wind, snow, and sickness. Families huddled together, trying to conserve warmth, trying to breathe over the stench of frozen mud, unwashed bodies, and the scent of fear itself. The dead were everywhere, yet almost nowhere. Those who had succumbed to disease, hunger, or exhaustion were often buried hastily, if at all. Sometimes the snow covered them before a spade could scratch the frozen earth. Sometimes they lay by the side of the road, hidden only by a tattered coat or a blanket discarded in haste. Children walked past bodies their parents had not yet had time to grieve. Mothers and fathers carried infants past elders who would never rise again. Each step was both progress and loss. Inside the camps, survival became ritual. Every meal ration was measured with anxious precision. Water was boiled whenever possible, but the supply was often too small. Disease thrived in the crowded conditions, invisible and unstoppable. Dysentery, cholera, measles, fever, they moved silently through families, picking off the weakest first. The cries of children in pain echoed through the night, muffled by blankets and snow, fading as exhaustion overtook even the strongest wails. The soldiers remained coldly indifferent. Some showed fleeting compassion, a shared ration, a whispered warning, but the orders were clear. Keep moving, count heads, mark the dead, keep the living marching. The living were not prisoners of cruelty, nor of hatred. They were prisoners of policy, of law, of a government determined that land mattered more than lives. By day, families scavenged what they could: firewood from stripped trees, snow-melted water, leftover food from abandoned wagons. By night they huddled together for warmth, whispering stories of home, of rivers and mountains they would never see again. Lullabies turned into prayers, songs of harvest became songs of survival, names of the dead were repeated over and over, so that at least memory could not be erased, even if the body could. Some children, weak from hunger, did not survive the nights. Mothers wrapped them in their own clothing and laid them beneath the snow. Fathers buried their loved ones in shallow graves, fighting the frozen earth with hands numb and cracked. Elders taught the living how to fold grief into endurance, how to walk forward with the weight of loss, pressing down, step after aching step. There were no markers. There were no witnesses beyond the living who were still marching. The snow erased footprints quickly, but memory etched itself deep. Every child who survived carried the names of those who did not. Every adult carried the weight of choices forced upon them. Every step westward was haunted. At night the wind seemed to carry whispers, not just the sound of the survivors, but the echoes of those who had died. They were never silent. The dead moved alongside the living, shaping every thought, every decision, every fleeting hope. And yet, amid this horror, survival persisted. A boy shared the last of his bread with a stranger's sister. A father lifted an orphan across icy plains. Mothers sang songs through cracked lips, keeping their children awake through nights of frost, whispering lessons of resilience no law could take away. These were the unsung heroisms, the acts history would rarely record. The camps of silence were also camps of defiance. Every heartbeat that survived, every breath drawn in bitter cold, every whispered name was an act of rebellion against the erasure attempted by law and policy. By the time the snow melted and spring arrived, the survivors were hollowed but alive. They had walked through the dead, past mass graves, and across lands that had never known them. Yet they had endured, they had remembered, they had carried on. The trail of tears had not ended with arrival. It had simply changed form. The road west had given way to open land, but that land was not home. The trauma, the grief, the absence, these walked with them still, and they would not be silent.
They arrived not with celebration, but with exhaustion so complete it blurred the line between life and death. The territory that the United States had promised as a new home was vast, open, and unforgiving. Forests stretched where rivers should have been, and the soil resisted every attempt at planting. Hills were empty, skies endless, and the wind, always the wind, carried no familiarity, no memory of home. Families spread across plots of land assigned by distant orders. They erected shelters from whatever timber and mud they could find, often working through snowmelt and rain. Every nail hammered, every wall raised, every fire built was a reminder that survival required labor beyond endurance, beyond grief. This land did not care who had walked its frozen roads before. It did not care about promises broken in Washington, D.C., or the corpses left behind. Children wandered through this new expanse as if in a dream. Some played quietly, clutching each other's hands, trying to imagine a home where laughter had not been replaced by fear. Some stared at the horizon, silent, haunted by roads they would never return to. Every path, every tree, every stream was unfamiliar, and yet they learned to map it in their hearts, as if memory could recreate the world that had been stolen. The adults knew better. Survival here required strategy. Fields had to be tilled, seeds planted, and water sources located. Yet every step forward was haunted by the losses behind them. Parents whispered names into the wind, the ones who had vanished along the march, the ones buried in unmarked graves. Grandparents recited stories aloud to ensure the young remembered what had been taken.
Survival without memory was impossible. Dysentery, fever, and scurvy claimed more lives in the first months than had been lost on some sections of the road. Aid from the government arrived sporadically, often too little, often too late. The promised supplies, tools, food, blankets, were delayed, stolen, or spoiled. Life was a test of will as much as endurance, a daily calculation of who could walk another step and who could not. Yet even in this harsh new land, the people began to rebuild. Towns were planned and constructed, schools reopened under whatever shelter could be scraped together, councils reformed to enforce laws, distribute rations, and protect the weak. Communities began again, fragile and fractious, but insistent on life. The survivors understood that survival itself was an act of rebellion against the system that had tried to erase them. The emotional scars, however, ran deep. Parents found themselves overprotective, teaching children lessons carved from trauma: move quickly, speak quietly, trust sparingly, remember everything. Children carried grief they did not fully understand, feeling responsibility for those who had died, for parents weakened by suffering. Elders mourned for centuries past, lamenting not only for the lost, but for the land they could no longer touch. And the land itself reminded them constantly that it was not theirs. Rivers did not behave as they had known them. Forests grew in patterns that made direction uncertain. Soil rejected seeds in the first planting. Every failed crop, every uncooperative stream, every harsh winter gust whispered that the march had not ended, it had only changed form. Yet amidst all of this, life persisted. Mothers sang lullabies by firelight, even when food was scarce. Fathers taught children how to hunt, plant, and carry on. Families protected each other fiercely, building a fragile sense of community. They planted the memory of home alongside the seeds of survival, ensuring that neither could be lost completely. The realization settled slowly. Survival had a cost beyond the road, beyond the snow, beyond the frozen corpses left behind. It demanded endurance of body, mind, and spirit, and it demanded that each generation remember the loss, even as they forged a new life. The Trail of Tears was no longer just a path, it was a shadow. It lived in the bones of those who had walked it, in the songs they taught, in the stories they whispered by firelight. And as they planted the first crops in the new land, they planted memory too, ensuring that their ancestors' voices would never vanish. But survival, even at its finest, could not erase the fact that part of them had been left behind. Part of their lives, part of their land, part of their history remained forever on the roads they had walked. The new land was theirs in body, but not yet in soul.
The United States had promised protection, civilization, and a new beginning. But promises are fragile things, easily broken when they conflict with desire. In reality, the Trail of Tears had been about one thing: land, wealth, expansion, control. Civilization was a mask for greed, and the law was nothing more than a tool to enforce it. Native nations had done everything expected of them. They had adopted written constitutions, established schools, and embraced some elements of European-style governance. They had demonstrated diplomacy and patience, proving they could coexist with settlers, adapt, and even thrive. Yet this was never enough. Their culture, their roots in the land, their very existence remained an obstacle to those who wanted more. The world back east celebrated progress. Newspapers wrote of removal as a necessary policy, framed it as humane, and painted the West as empty land awaiting cultivation. Few mentioned the thousands dead along the roads, the children buried in the snow, or the mothers carrying infants whose tiny bodies would never see a home again. Numbers became sanitized, abstract. Human suffering was reduced to statistics. 15,000 deaths were footnotes, not crimes.
Even treaties became instruments of betrayal. Agreements signed under duress were ratified as law. Treaties meant to guarantee survival were used to justify further displacement. When native leaders resisted, they were dismissed as obstacles. When they complied, they were blamed for the suffering that followed. There was no winning. There was only survival, and that too was a bitter victory. The children who survived were taught to adapt quickly. They learned the lies of civilization at the same time they learned the harsh truths of survival. Schools opened in Indian territory, but the curriculum rarely acknowledged the injustice that had brought them there. History books told the story of pioneers and progress while erasing the forced marches, the deaths, and the lives uprooted. Generations later, the trauma persisted. Parents carried memories of snow-covered roads, frozen bodies, and the constant hunger of the march. Children inherited fear, hypervigilance, and the knowledge that law and justice could not be relied upon. Culture and language were preserved in secret, whispered in homes and around fires, but constantly threatened by policies designed to erase them. Even when survivors rebuilt their communities, they were never fully free. The land they now occupied was not entirely theirs. Settlers encroached, government agents monitored, and the shadow of removal lingered over every decision. The United States had proven that laws were only as powerful as the willingness to enforce or ignore them, and that might, military, political, or economic, would always trump morality. Yet within these communities, life endured. Religion, ceremonies, and stories became acts of resistance. Songs were sung at night. Stories were passed to children. Rituals were preserved, even when done in secret. Every act of remembrance was a defiance of erasure, a refusal to let history be rewritten by those who had caused the suffering. The lie of civilization was evident in every broken promise. It was evident in every family that had been lost, every elder who died on the march, every child buried along the roadside. Civilization, as the United States defined it, was a lie, but humanity, as carried by the survivors, became a testament. Memory became survival. Memory became resistance. Memory became the only law that could not be ignored. The Trail of Tears was no longer just a historical event. It became a moral marker, a measure of the courage, resilience, and refusal to vanish of an entire people. Even as the centuries passed, the land bore witness. Rivers remembered the footsteps. Trees held the echoes of voices. Stones pressed beneath the soil carried the names of those left behind. And those who walked the roads after them learned that survival was not enough. To truly honor the fallen, memory must live, and the truth must be told. The lesson of the Trail of Tears is not buried in the past. It is alive in every act of remembrance, in every story told, in every child taught the names of ancestors stolen by policy and greed. Civilization, as the United States defined it, was a lie, but humanity, as carried by the survivors, became a testament. The Trail of Tears ended only in geography. The march stopped, the survivors reached the territory, and the army withdrew. Yet the road itself did not end. It stretched through memory, through bones, through the hearts of those who lived and their descendants who would inherit the grief. Survivors looked around the new land, planting crops and building homes, but every hill, every river, every stretch of frozen ground carried echoes of what had been lost. Fathers who had carried children now carried guilt. Mothers who had buried infants now carried silence. Elders who had survived the impossible now carried stories too heavy for even the young to hear in one sitting. Time passed, but the scars remained. The
The next generation grew in unfamiliar forests, on soil they could till but never truly call their own. They learned songs their ancestors had sung. They learned words that spoke of rivers, mountains, and fields they would never see. They learned the taste of resilience. They learned grief alongside hope. The land east of the Mississippi was never theirs again. Towns rose on graves, roads cut through former homesteads. Gold mined from Cherokee lands lined the pockets of strangers. Progress had its cost. But those who survived carried the proof of existence. Memory refused erasure. Names whispered by parents became law of survival. Stories passed on became shields against oblivion. Even the government's laws could not erase that. Even time itself could not fully hide what had happened. Survivors told their children, who told their children, who told their children, who carried the trail in their bodies, their hearts, and their songs. 15,000 lives lost, countless souls displaced, millions of tears shed, but the people endured. In quiet moments, at night by firelight or under open skies, descendants of the marchers would stop and listen. Some would close their eyes and imagine the snow, the mud, the frozen roads, the mothers' songs, the children's cries, the dead left behind. And in that silence, the road still spoke. It spoke of injustice, of betrayal, of loss. It spoke of courage, of love, of humanity. It spoke of survival when the world demanded disappearance. And the truth of the Trail of Tears, the full weight of what was done and what was endured, could never be fully told. Yet it must be remembered, not only to honor the dead, but to witness the endurance of those who walked, who carried the living forward, and who refused to vanish. The road ended in place, but it never ended in spirit. It stretches still, in stories whispered, in names spoken aloud, in memory carried forward. The Trail of Tears is not just a history, it is a living testament. A testament to loss, a testament to survival, a testament to the truth that some roads, no matter how far, never truly leave those who walk them behind. And those who walk today, remembering, carry both the weight of sorrow and the light of defiance. The land may have tried to erase them, the road may have tried to crush them, but the people endured, and their memory endures still.